please join me in welcoming Associate Professor Jane Hunter.
Thank you, Lauren. So it's a really great pleasure to be here this afternoon, and congratulations everyone for staying on and being here right to the end. So hopefully this will be a whole lot of new understandings at this late stage of the day, but I just wanted to say a public thank you to the work that Fred and his team do, and to Lauren. They work relentlessly. I mean, this work is just inspiring in terms of the way that it offers all sorts of teachers, all sorts of schools, leaders and beyond, in partnership with universities, the opportunity to learn more professionally. So thank you, Fred, for your work, and thank you, Lauren, for you do so much as well. And putting together these sorts of programs is no easy feat, and congratulations to all of you for being here in your holidays. That deserves, extra bonus points. If I was Jason Clare, you'd have much bigger pay packets. So I'm working towards helping with that whole situation currently. Okay, so has anyone heard of high possibility classrooms before? Is it new to most people? Okay, all right, so I first would like to acknowledge country. I live on Bidjigal country, so quite about an hour's drive east from here. That land was never ceded, and it's what is the home right on the coast of lots of women who collected and gathered and ate and fed their families from the rich resources that the coast provides. So I also wanted to publicly say that the Voice to Parliament has been launched, and as educators in all our different places, I believe we have a real duty to ensure that Voice to Parliament gets up. So as teachers, we have to be aware of the broader political context of our work, and many of you would have Indigenous children or have taught Indigenous children in your classes, workplaces and so on. So this afternoon, what I'm going to share with you is some findings from my new book. Now, this was three studies that were conducted over 4 years. And it's contained in this book. So doing it in half an hour is going to be quite an interesting challenge. So I just need to keep my eye on my analogue watch here. So I've left my mobile at the back of the room. That's okay. So I want to essentially, and this is, I think, quite brave in many ways, this is a call to action for you as teachers of STEM to do things differently. Now, I am from the humanities. I did high-level maths and science to the HSC. I've been around education for far too long as a classroom teacher, teacher educator, worked in policy, worked for Della Bosco, Bob Carr, and worked in 3 different universities. So I like to think that I've walked on both sides of the road, and I've always been a great advocate for teachers. So what I'm saying here then is that we can't keep teaching, and I would imagine that all of you who are here today tackle teaching STEM in a very different way. But I go into many schools where it's textbook driven, and essentially the teaching and learning hasn't changed a lot, especially in the high school space. And I was just saying to our speaker from Anstow before that how are we going to get teachers into maths and science and the STEM disciplines if we don't have those young people wanting to do those subjects right from the get-go once they start school, choosing those options, those high-level options towards the end of their time at school, and then going on to pursue those careers. So I will, I guess, challenge you throughout what I'm going to say this afternoon to be thinking about, well, how can I do things differently? I'm assuming, as I said before, that because you're here, you probably already do. And some of the things that you are going to hear me share with you this afternoon, you probably think, well, gosh, I do that, and I do that. And that's fantastic, because out of that research over 4 years came a new, what I'm calling, it's not a framework, it's a set of guidelines. And that's what I'm calling high possibility STEM schools. Now, that's not to say that you have to have all of those things in place, but if you're going to recharge the way in which STEM is done in your school, then you need to be thinking about some of the findings that came out of this research. So those 10 directions are what I'm calling a blueprint, and I'm going to talk about those in detail as we go through. So, as I said, my latest book, I also have, if you can follow me on Twitter, Jane Hunter 01, if you do that, and it'd be lovely to be able to follow you back, and also my High Possibility Classrooms website, which has a lot of really useful resources, blog material, interviews, a whole range of materials, so you can also have a look at that at your leisure. So I guess what I'm saying to you this afternoon is that we are at a bit of a crossroads in education. On Friday, I've actually got a one-on-one with Jason Clare's office. Now, I do a lot of work in the political spaces, separate to my university work and my day job, if you like, and so I was able, through a whole range of different channels, to get the opportunity to speak one-on-one with Jason Clare's senior advisor. I've been in that kind of role myself in the past, but not for some time. So I want to talk to that advisor about the shortage and what things need to shift. And that itself would be a whole half an hour conversation. So we're not going to go there this afternoon. So we are at a crossroads. I better get that little gif off because you'll all be going cross-eyed on the crossroads. Okay, so we're in a tricky situation because we have the shortage, and it's not only New South Wales, it's across Australia, it's across the world. And it's not going to get better. And I look at the young people that I hopefully inspire to go into classrooms. I've actually been out on prac supervision for the first time in about 10 years since I was at Sydney University, where I did 3,000 kilometres over a 4-week period, and I used to say to my colleagues, I can go for my cab driver's licence, that like they do in London, where you've got to, those scooters follow around and you follow a map and you have to be able to do it off the top of your head. Those cabbies in London are quite something else. So I thought that I could do that in Sydney after that experience of prac supervision. So that was really interesting for me to see what's at a different space in schools, because I'm in schools all the time. I'm working currently with a school not very far, a big high school, brand new high school not far from here, and another school on the Central Coast, which is a primary school. So I work at the elbow of teachers, get my hands dirty, teach the odd lesson, as well as do the research, collect the data, and so on. So we've had, it's been a tricky time, to say the very least. With COVID, we've had natural disasters, and we're actually looking down the barrel of another wet summer in Australia, and goodness knows what that will bring to all of us and to those schools. So it's a very challenging time to be a teacher. And sadly, some of my very recent graduates, and that's just me anecdotally, who started in classrooms full of excitement for being in a secondary school, have already left, never to return. 2 of them out of 16. So they didn't even want to have the conversation, and yet we had a really good relationship through the course of their studies. So that sort of gives me goosebumps when I hear that kind of, I'm just not doing it. So, and that's just one story. Okay, so the pandemic then has shone a spotlight on the relationship between schools and as social institutions. And as Dylan Willem, I think, said a number of years, well, last year he wrote a paper. I often try and read a lot of his work, and those of you who are interested in, I guess, that sort of scholarly work around assessment, Dylan Willem is always a good person to have a look at. He says that we need to stop looking for the next big thing and instead doing the last thing properly. I think there's huge amounts of change fatigue out there. It's another syllabus. It's, oh, well, that review came out, but nothing is actually unfolded with regard to that. So we do another review. Oh, it's teacher education's fault, and so on. This is a new innovation. We're going to reduce the syllabus content down. We're going to just focus in on fewer outcomes. Well, what happened to all of that with NESA? It's in a hiatus. So we need to be thinking about what we can do in our own classrooms with our own teams in our schools. That's where we can make that difference, and that's where we can get that professional satisfaction. The bigger meta issues, I think, sometimes are too big. And so if we can focus on making a difference for those people in front of us, then that's, I believe, what really counts. So, Christiana Figueres, I was lucky enough to see her speak. It was the last public talk that she gave, and it was actually the last public talk at the University of New South Wales before the pandemic really hit in 2020. I just started to write my book, and I was lucky enough to go and hear her speak. And she talks about this idea of what she terms as, we have two choices for the future, she says, that we can either keep doing, thinking about the world that we're creating, but also the world that we want to create. And so she has these ideas of stubborn optimism, endless abundance with a radical view to regeneration. And I just thought, when I was listening to her, she spoke about this book called Range. Now, that was a New York bestseller, and that book is really interesting because it was written by a sports journalist, but he makes the case that in a world of complexity, generalists will be the ones that survive. Specialists, yes, we need them, but we need people who can look over the silos. How do we solve climate change if it's purely a scientific angle? Look what happened in the pandemic. We saw those amazing engineers work together to create those ventilators, thousands of them. We saw the scientists and the doctors, medical people work towards our incredible vaccines. But we needed the statisticians to keep us alive to what the situation was and is. We needed all of those disciplines, the communications people, the people from the arts, and so on, to actually ensure that we could get on top of the pandemic. And I think it was just last week that the President of the United Nations declared the pandemic over, in theory. So I'm not quite sure about that because some of us, today's the first day I've been inside in a public place without my mask on. I feel a bit nervous, but that's okay. So that's an interesting idea when you think about being a generalist and why I think STEM and science and maths have stagnated in schools because we won't work with anyone else. And when I was doing a project with 8 schools in Victoria, it was a mathematics educator from the AIS, very experienced, and he said to me, Jane, but you've got to understand that maths teachers only go to maths conferences, and they only hear from maths educators. And mathematics academics only write and cite other mathematics educators. They don't look anywhere else, and the same with the scientists. So we've got to, I guess, challenge the young people that we work with, our co-teachers, our head teachers, that we've got to look to the other disciplines. Okay, so from a theory and evidence point of view, high possibility classrooms is a good news story, I'm here to tell you folks. So this was work that I originally did leading up to 2013, and it's been published, peer-reviewed, validated, not only just within the concept, within the STEM disciplines, but in a whole range of other discipline areas as well. So I've taken this work to the UK, I've taken it to the US, and also to Victoria, South Australia, and the ACT, as well as New South Wales. So it's a good news story. This is the original work, which was in-depth studies over several years in the classrooms of these extraordinary teachers. I really wanted to deeply understand their pedagogical practice when it came to the integration of technology. How did they conceptualise it? So what came out of that study in those classrooms from stage 1 to stage 5 were 5 conceptions. And underneath those 5 conceptions sit 22 pedagogical themes and student learning strategies. So that is the high possibility classrooms framework that I've used to drive work that I've done in schools, but more recently the STEM work to bring those disciplines together, and you can read more about that. Okay, so let's get on to the main event. Okay, so what I would like to share with you this afternoon, I guess, is the work that's in the book. And this is a study. These are 3 studies conducted in 14 schools. So 2 smaller studies over a shorter period of time and a much larger study over 18 months. And they were all about building teacher capacity to integrate STEM. I actually think we need to have, I'd go further than Manuela, is it Manuela who was here with the STEM Academy, and actually talk about integration with a capital I, and throughout my book it has a capital I. So these studies took place in high NESB schools, some of our most multicultural schools in Australia, high poverty schools not very far from here, and highly urban schools, which was the much longer and larger study. So what I really wanted to have a look at is it possible for teachers to actually reach this level of transdisciplinarity? So integration is one thing, multi-discipline STEM is another, so is this idea of interdisciplinary STEM, but transdisciplinary is the most hardest to achieve. And there were very few teachers in all of those studies that were able to get to that point by the time those research projects finished. So, but what's interesting and why I took this angle is that some of the world's leading STEM people like Richard Teese, Tytler, Bybee, these are names that Emma Johnson, Maxine Green, who's one of my favourite education people, she's a philosopher. So all of these people were saying that we've got to do STEM differently. And so it's what their argument was, it's not so much the content is important, but the pedagogy has to shift. It has to shift. So Bybee, one of the leading science educators in the world, said this. Russell Tytler, another Professor Emerita, done amazing projects, not only at the school level, university and so on, but was calling for a change in pedagogy. And so that's where somebody like myself, who's had a sort of a great interest in what does great classroom teaching look like for well over 30 years, took up that gauntlet, I guess. So it is, as Julianne was saying, it's this idea of big questions, significant problems and complex ideas. So all of these teachers engaged in a variety, but often inquiry-based processes. So, and I agree with Julianne's point about questions, and so I work as the academic partner to support that question asking, because it's not so much the questions, it's how do you plan integrated learning sequences? A lot of teachers get locked into this one activity, another activity, another activity. And so across a day, it's not sequential, it's not related. And so for many young people, they're not really certain what is it that the teacher is saying that I need to learn. How will I know I've got there? And how will you as the teacher know that? And what am I going to do to support them to understand those big concepts and those big ideas? Okay, so this is a new paper which is a systematic review of integrated STEM instruction, and you can see that underneath that sit not only problem-centred the integration, but inquiry forms a large part. That's a really great paper that I found more or less towards the end of when I was writing my book, but it was the culmination of a lot of work. And it's interesting that Finland, and I know Finland, and that's, you know, Pasi Sahlberg and all of that, Finland's a very different cultural context, but Finland has no disciplines as of this year in their schools. So they're moving to what they call a phenomena approach to teaching and learning. So they've got rid of the silos completely, which is really interesting. Okay, so let's have a look at this work then. So what I did was I worked with 5 schools in the very first project, the non-English speaking background. There were 3 schools that were designated high poverty, very disadvantaged contexts, and the last project, the much longer project over almost 18 months, was in 6 schools. And that took place across 4 years. And now these were all invited studies. So the principals of those schools collectively had seen me speak in different places, principals' conferences and so on, had heard about the work and had asked me to come and work. They pooled all their resources because obviously if it's a research project, it's got to have money. The university won't let you go out and just, you know, spread your pro bono love everywhere. You've got to bring in the dollars. And so they pooled their resources, each of those schools, and there were teachers within each of those schools that came forward to be involved. And a total of 59 teachers across those 14 school sites was what I was able to collect data from. This is the blueprint that came out of the findings of the research. Let's just have a look at that. So this is some of we conducted various workshops with experts from everywhere. There was quantitative data collected around where teachers were at the beginning, where they were at the end of the research, and there was a whole range of action research approaches that were used as part of the study. So there was a lot going on, and it was demanding for those teachers. But as in any research, you have to have people that are volunteers. And I have to say, and somebody asked me this the other day when I was talking to a group of teachers, they were saying, so did everyone come on board out of those 59? I have to say that of those 59 teachers, there was only one that didn't in the interviews, in the meetings. She was there. Her principal really wanted her to go to have some, I guess, professional learning because that was felt necessary, but she was there under sufferance. She did complete the work. She was actually in a much larger project, but she felt that she didn't need it. And so I have to say that she was really, there's always one in every crowd, isn't there? But I guess it's important to focus on the fact that 58 teachers really saw enormous improvements in the way they understood how to integrate STEM and how their students responded as part of that, because also the research involved interviews with students, with the principals of those schools, and also with groups of parents at some of the sites. So, as you would know, with the current issues around the shortage, teachers have to have time to plan. They're not, as Sarah Mitchell would like us to think, going to just go to a template and teach that way. No. Blackline Masters, no. So this idea of just providing a set of resources or a set of templates to teach is just not, that's our professional practice. We're bowerbirds, we take a bit of this, we take a bit of that, we learn this, we take that, and it all forms part of our practice. But they have to have time to plan. And I have this saying, it's called planning hard to teach easy. So if you do all the planning up front, the weeks roll out over the term, and because you know where you're going. One of the things that is common in the work around these kind of student-centred agentic projects where young people are given charge of their learning. They're not, as John Hattie would say, a free-for-all. Inquiry, he's very critical of inquiry. Inquiry-based learning is actually highly structured teaching to be unstructured. And it's tiring because it's almost individualised, working in teams, working with those groups, and it's demanding teaching.